The pearl came loose in her hand on a cold March morning, and Goldie Alquist went very still, because girls like her did not find pearls. She was 23, 11 nights into sleeping in a shut-down bait shop, and she had pried the mussel out of the river mud because she was hungry, not because she was hoping. But the river had put something in her palm anyway, small and silver and strange, and 3 weeks later, that single pearl would buy her a forgotten pearl button works on the riverbank at Pearl Landing in Louisa County, Iowa, on a slow bend of the Mississippi that had not cut a button from a shell since the works fell silent in 1951. The cottonwood planks had gone gray as bone. The tin roof had rusted clean through. But what nobody knew, least of all Goldie, was that the woman who built that works was still alive, 91 years old and waiting, and that beneath the false floor of the old sorting bin lay something that would change her life forever. Before we go on, if these stories mean something to you, take a moment and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It means more than you know to see how far these stories travel. Goldie had grown up with the sound of the emery wheel and the smell of wet shell, which is a smell most people have never smelled and never will, a cold mineral smell, river and lime and something faintly like rain on hot stone, the smell of mother of pearl being ground to a curve. Her grandmother had run a button card table in the front room of a rented house in Davenport, and Goldie had sat under that table as a small girl among the drifts of shell dust and watched her grandmother's hands move. And her grandmother had taught her the trade the way the women of the river had always taught it, not with lessons, but with proximity, by letting the child sit close enough, long enough, that the knowing soaked in. Her grandmother could tell a 3-ridge shell from a mucket by the weight of it in the dark. She could look at a button blank no bigger than a thumbnail and know whether the cutter had taken it from the thick heel of the shell where the nacre ran deep and the button would shine for 100 years, or from the thin lip where it would craze and dull inside a decade. The hand knows what the eye can be fooled about, her grandmother said, and a button woman who trusts only her eyes is a button woman who cards trash. The knowing came down the way the river comes down, gathering as it goes, through the women of the family, through the worn button on its cord, until it reached a girl who had nothing else. The works at Pearl Landing was older than the locks and dams that tamed the river. It had begun the spring a young woman named Hedvig Sundqvist came up from the levee at New Orleans in 1903 with a foot-powered cutting lathe crated in straw and a head full of the trade she had learned in a Muscatine cutting shop. And she had looked at the slow brown bend of the river at Pearl Landing, where the current eased and the mussels bedded thick in the shallows, and she had decided that the bend was the place. She had been 22. She had no money to speak of, and no husband, and no one who thought a young woman had any business owning a works, and she had built it anyway. A low frameworks of cottonwood plank right at the water's edge where the clammers could pole their john boats up to the door and tip their catch straight onto the sorting floor. She had hired the wives and the widows and the daughters of the river town because the cutting was given to men, but the facing and the sorting and the carding, the work that turned a rough blank into a button, a woman would sew onto her Sunday dress, that work was given to women. And Hedvig had been a woman, and she had built a place where the women of the river could earn. The works at Pearl Landing turned shell into buttons without a single idle season for 48 years, through Hedvig and through the women she trained, and the trade passed hand to hand, the way the shells passed hand to hand down the sorting line, woman to woman, the old ones teaching the young ones, until the plastic buttons came, and the mussel beds thinned, and the river fell silent of the trade for good. There was a rule in the cutting shops, and Hedvig had hated it her whole life. When the women opened the shells to clean them for cutting, every so often, perhaps once in 1,000 shells, the river had left something inside. A pearl. A small, irregular freshwater pearl, born of a grain of sand the mussel had wrapped in nacre to ease its own pain, the way a body wraps a wound, until the thing that hurt it had become the only beautiful thing it would ever make. And the rule, in every shop up and down the river, was that the pearls belonged to the owner. A woman who found a pearl in the meat of a shell was to set it in the brass cup by the door, and the owner sold it, and the woman who found it got nothing but the wage she was already owed. The pearls were the one thing of beauty the women's own hands pulled from the river, and the pearls were the one thing the women were forbidden to keep. Hedvig had stood at that brass cup as a girl of 14 in Muscatine, with her knuckles split from the cold shell water, and she had dropped a pearl into it the color of the inside of her own wrist, and the foreman had not even looked up, and something in her had set hard that day like mortar going off. She had decided, the way a young woman decides a thing once and keeps it for 60 years, that when she had a shop of her own there would be no brass cup, and the women who found the pearls would keep the pearls, and what the river gave to a woman's hands would stay in a woman's hands. And so it was at Pearl Landing for 48 years. The brokers in Chicago told her she was pouring money into the river. Hedvig Sundqvist let them say it, and kept her table full of women who would have walked through ice for her, and never once set out a brass cup. The mentor who raised Goldie was her grandmother, Sina, and Sina had learned the trade at Hedvig's own sorting table as a girl of 10 in 1936, in the last good years of the works before the war and the plastic finished it. Sina had told Goldie about Hedvig the way some grandmothers tell about saints, not with worship, but with a kind of stubborn factual pride. Hedvig Sundqvist paid us in money and she paid us in pearls, Sina said, and there was not another shop on the whole river that did the second thing. Sina had a way of teaching that was all in her hands in her short, flat sentences. She would put a blank in Goldie's palm and close the child's fingers over it and say, thick or thin. And Goldie would feel for the weight and the slight dome of it and say, thick or thin, and she was wrong for a long time, and then one day she was not wrong anymore. And Sina never praised her, only stopped correcting her, and the stopping was the praise. She taught the same way with color. She would hold 2 buttons to the window, near enough alike that anyone else would have called them the same, and she would say, which one has the fire? And Goldie learned to see the deep moving light inside the good one, the light that came up out of the nacre instead of lying on top of it. By the time Goldie was 8, she could sort a tray of blanks by grade faster than she could tie her shoes. By 10, she could face a button against a turning wheel without burning the nacre brown, easing off at the exact breath before the heat bloomed. By 12, she could look at a finished button and tell you which river it came out of, because the Mississippi shell and the Wapsipinicon shell and the shell that came down the cedar all carried a different fire in the nacre, the way wine carries the ground it grew in. The river is in the button, Sina told her. People think a button is a dead little thing. A button is the last living color of an animal that filtered this river for 10 years. You hold 100 years of the river when you hold a good pearl button. Mind it. Sina had also been honest about what the trade had cost, which was the part the saints' stories left out. She told Goldie about the lung trouble the shell dust gave the old women, the way it settled in them like silt in a slack channel and never washed back out. She told Goldie that the work had been hard and cold, and the pay had been small, that the river water cracked your hands open at the knuckle every winter until the skin there went to leather, and that the river had drowned more than one clammer's husband and left more than one button woman to raise her children on a sorter's wage. She did not pretty it, but she also told Goldie that the women of the works had owned something the women in the factories in town did not own, which was the pearls and the pride and each other. We had a thing that was ours, Sina said. The men cut the blanks and the men sold the buttons and the men's names were on the crates. But the pearls were ours, and Hedvig saw to it, and you do not forget a woman who sees to a thing like that. Sina died when Goldie was 19, in a chair by a window in a small apartment in Davenport, with a tray of old buttons in her lap she had been sorting for no reason, except that her hands still wanted to. Goldie had been the one to find her. The tray tipped just slightly in her lap so that a few buttons had spilled and lay shining on the floor, and Goldie had picked them up one by one before she did anything else, before she called anyone, because she could not bear to leave them on the floor. She had taken from that apartment 3 things and left the rest: the button on its cord that her grandmother had worn her whole life, a flat thumbnail-sized disc of mother of pearl that Sina said had been cut at Pearl Landing in 1939, a sorting needle worn to a hook by 60 years of use, the wood of its handle gone dark and glossy as a chestnut, and a single photograph of a row of women at a long table by a river, their heads down over their work, one of them young and one of them old, and most of them in between. After that, the years went the way they go when no one is holding the rope for you. The aunt who took Goldie in meant well and had nothing, and then lost even that. the house going to the bank in a bad winter. The jobs were the kind that end without warning. A diner that closed, a motel that changed hands, a cannery that let the seasonal girls go the day after the season. And in the spring of her 23rd year, Goldie came back to the river, because the river was the only place that had ever felt like it knew her name. And she slept in a closed bait shop with her grandmother's button against her breastbone and pried mussels from the mud for food, and the river, on a cold March morning, put a pearl in her hand. If these stories are reaching you tonight, take a second to subscribe. It truly does help us keep making them. And tell us in the comments, was there ever a thing your family was good at that the world stopped having a use for? She did not sell the pearl. She carried it 8 miles in her pocket to the only place she could think to ask what it was worth, which was the Little River History Museum in Pearl Landing, 2 rooms in an old bank building kept open 3 days a week by a retired lockmaster named Mr. Albert Raint. He turned the pearl over under his desk lamp with a clamor's blunt fingers, and he did not tell her what it was worth. Instead, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Where did your people come off the river?" Goldie told him her grandmother had sorted buttons at a works down here when she was a girl, a place called Pearl Landing, run by a woman named Sundqvist. Mr. Raint set the pearl down very carefully on the green blotter, the way a man sets down something he has just realized is fragile. "Sundqvist," he said. And then he said a thing Goldie did not understand for several seconds. "She is still up at the county home. Hedvig. She is 91, and she does not get visitors, because everybody that knew her is dead, and the staff thinks she is confused because she talks about pearls." The room was very quiet. "The works is still standing," Mr. Raint said. "The county would let it go for nothing, $3 and the back taxes forgiven, just to have it off the books before the next flood takes it." He looked at the button on the cord around Goldie's neck, and his face changed, the way a face changes when it recognizes a thing it has not seen in 50 years. "But I would not buy that building, miss, until I had gone and seen the woman who built it. She has been waiting on somebody a long time. I do not think she's been waiting on a buyer." Goldie walked the 2 miles to the county home that same afternoon. They told her the old woman was in the day room by the south windows and was having a clear day, which they said in the careful way that meant the clear days were running out. Hedvig Sundqvist was small and folded, and her hands lay in her lap like 2 things set down and forgotten. And she did not look up when Goldie sat down across from her, until Goldie did the only thing she could think to do, which was to take the button off the cord around her neck and set it on the table between them. The old woman looked at the button. Then she picked it up and held it to the window light and turned it, and her thumb found the slight dome of it the way a thumb finds a thing it has touched 10,000 times. And she said, in a voice like a door that has not been opened in a while, "This came off the heel of a 3-ridge shell. Good fire in it. This is a Pearl Landing button, and it was cut in the shop, not bought in. I would know my own shell anywhere." And she looked up, and her eyes were not confused at all. They were the clear, flat gray of river ice. "Who are you?" she said. Goldie said, "Sina Alquist was my grandmother. She sorted at your table." And the old woman's folded hands came up off her lap and pressed flat against the table, slowly, as if she were steadying herself against the tilt of the years, and she said, "Sina, the little one who could grate a tray faster than she could tie her shoes, the little one who used to hum at the table. We told her to hush and she never could, and after a while we stopped telling her, because the humming was a good sound, and the work was hard, and you keep the good sounds where you can." They sat together until the light went down. Hedvig talked and Goldie listened, and the staff brought a second cup of tea, and then stopped hovering and left them to it. Hedvig told her about the works, the cottonwood plank floor that never quite dried out, and the foot lathe with the cracked treadle she had splinted with iron and used for 40 years anyway, and the long sorting table by the water where the light came off the river in the afternoon and moved on the ceiling. She told her about the women, naming them, Alma and Tilda and Birgit and Sina, the way you would name the rooms of a house you grew up in. And then, near the end, when the windows had gone from gold to gray, Hedvig leaned forward and said the thing she had been holding for 40 years. "There is a sorting bin," she said, "at the works, long oak bin against the river wall, where we tip the cleaned shells. It has a false floor. I built it myself, fitted it, and pinned it so you would never find the seam unless you knew to feel for it. Underneath it, I put what was mine to put, and I never told a living soul, because the only people I would have told were dying off faster than I could trust them, and a secret is only safe with someone who will outlive you, and I outlived them all. Goldie said, "What is under it?" And Hedvig Sundqvist smiled for the first time, a small, terrible, wonderful smile that took 20 years off her face, and said, "Every pearl those women were never let to keep. I bought them. Every pearl any woman ever found at my table for 48 years. I bought it off her for a fair price out of my own pocket the day she found it, and I put it under the floor of that bin, because I could not stand to sell them, because they were the river's gift to a woman's hands, and I would not pass them on to some button broker in Chicago to sit on a rich man's coat. They were ours. I kept them ours." She closed her eyes. "Go and lift the floor," she said, "and bring me one. I would like to hold one more before I go. I have not held one in 40 years. The works at Pearl Landing stood gray and leaning at the water's edge, the cottonwood planks silver as bone, the tin roof rusted through so the sky showed in long, ragged seams, the river breathing against the foundation the way it had for 120 years. Mr. Rayant had given Goldie the key, an iron key on a loop of twine that he had kept in the museum desk for 30 years, left there, he said, by Hedvig's own hand the year she went into the home, with instructions he had never understood until that day, to give it to whoever came asking about the women, not about the buttons, not about the building, about the women. Inside, the light came down through the broken roof in pale, shifting bars, and the dust of 50 years lay over everything, and the long sorting table stood where it had always stood, and against the river wall, the long oak sorting bin, its surface worn pale and smooth and slightly hollowed by half a century of cleaned shell tipped across it. Goldie knelt and felt along the bottom, and for a long moment found nothing, only smooth oak, and then her fingers caught the seam, so fine it was less a gap than a change in the grain, set flush and pinned exactly as the old woman had said. She worked it up with the worn sorting needle her grandmother had left her, the hook of it sliding into the seam as if it had been ground to that shape for this and not for shell, and the false floor lifted away with a small dry sigh of old wood, and the river light fell into the dark beneath it. She did not cry. She sat back on her heels in the cold river, light coming through the broken roof, and she looked at what Hedvig Sundqvist had hidden, and she pressed her grandmother's button to her lips and breathed in the cold mineral smell of the river and the wet shell that was the smell of her whole childhood, the smell of being small and safe under a table among the shell dust, while a woman she loved made beautiful things with her hands. Under the floor of the bin, in a long tray lined with oilcloth gone soft as skin, lay the pearls. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Small and irregular, and every color the river makes, milk and silver and rose and the faint gold of a winter dawn and the deep gray of the channel in November, each one a thing a woman's hands had pulled from a shell and been forbidden to keep and been quietly, secretly given back, one woman to all the women across 48 years. Beside the tray lay a button-card sample book, every pattern the works had ever cut, mounted and labeled in a firm upright hand, the whole record of the trade. And there was no sealed letter, because the woman who would have written it was 8 miles up the road, alive, waiting to say it herself, and that was the thing Goldie understood as she knelt there, that for once the letter from the dead was not from the dead, that she could carry the answer back to the one who had asked the question. But laid on top of the pearls, where the writer of a letter would have set her closing line, was a single card, gone soft at the corners, and on it, in that same upright hand, were 11 words. For the next woman, the river sends. The pearls are hers. The pearls, a dealer in Davenport told Goldie a week later, turning them under his lamp with the slow reverence of a man handling something that should not exist, were worth $53,000. And more than that to a museum, because freshwater pearls of that age and that number, with that provenance, simply did not come on the market anymore, and never would again. But Goldie had already decided what she would do, and she had decided it kneeling on the cold floor of the works with the river coming through the roof. She took one pearl, the smallest, milk going to silver, and she carried it 8 miles back to the county home, and she put it in Hedvig Sundqvist's open hand, and the old woman closed her folded fingers over it and held it to her chest, and did not speak for a long time. And the tears that came down her face she did not lift a hand to wipe, as if they were not worth interrupting the holding for. Then she said, "You will keep the works." It was not a question. Goldie said, "Yes." And the old woman said, "Then I have not been waiting on a buyer. I have been waiting on you. I did not know your face, but I knew you would come, because the river does not waste a thing, and it does not waste a girl who can hear an emery wheel in her sleep." In the months that followed, Goldie woke the works. She used the pearl money to lift the building above the flood line, and to mend the tin roof, and to rebuild the long sorting table by the water from the same cottonwood. And she did not turn it back into a factory, because the mussel beds were protected now, and the river could not be asked to give the way it once gave. She made it something else. She made it a place where the trade could be remembered, and the buttons could be made again by hand, a few at a time, from shell that washed up legal and dead on the bars after high water. And she hung the photograph of the row of women on the wall above the table, and she set out her grandmother's hooked sorting needle where her own hand could reach it. An old woman named Birgit Lund, who turned out to be one of the names Hedvig had spoken in the day room, came on a Sunday with a tin of cardamom bread and stood weeping in the doorway because she had not thought to see the inside of the works again in this life. And she sat at the rebuilt table and showed Goldie the carding stitch the way it was done in 1940, her old hands remembering it whole the moment the thread was in them. A clammer's son brought a foot lathe he had kept in a barn for 60 years because he could never bring himself to scrap it. A woman drove 3 hours to bring back a single button card her mother had bought at the works in 1948 and kept her whole life, and would not take money for it, and only wanted to see it hung on the wall where it had been made. The town came back to the works a little at a time, the way the river comes back to a sandbar, leaving a little more each season. Hedvig Sundqvist lived to see it. Goldie brought her down to the river on a warm afternoon in the first summer, in a wheelchair over the rough ground, and set her at the head of the rebuilt sorting table where she had sat for 48 years, and put a tray of fresh-cut blanks in front of her, and the old woman's ruined hands came up off the armrests and moved over the blanks, thick or thin, grading them true and fast and certain, 60 years of knowing still alive in the fingers after so much else had begun to go dim. She sorted a whole tray that afternoon and got not one of them wrong, and when she was done, she laid her hand flat on the table and looked out at the river for a long while and said only, "It is the same water." It is not, of course, it is never the same water, but it is always the same river. And that was what she meant, and Goldie understood her. She died that autumn with the small milk-silver pearl still in the drawer of her bedside table, and she left the works and everything in it to Goldie in a will she had made the week after Goldie first came. And on the line where the lawyer had asked her to state her relationship to the beneficiary, Hedvig Sundqvist had written, in the same firm, upright hand that had labeled the cards, "The next woman the river sent." The button on its cord hung on a nail above the sorting table now, where the afternoon light came off the river and caught it. The hooked needle lay in the tray where Goldie's hand could find it without looking. The sample book sat open on a stand by the window, turned to the first page, the first button Hedvig ever cut in the autumn of 1903. And the pearls, all but the few Goldie kept, went into a glass case in the little museum in town, with a card that did not name Hedvig as the owner, but named all of them. Alma and Tilda and Birgit and Sina and the rest, every woman who had ever found one in the cold meat of a shell and been forbidden to keep it, so that their names were on something at last, and not just the names of the men on the crates. That is the thing about the trades our grandmothers came up in, the ones the world found a way to stop needing. They were never really about the thing the hands made. The button work was never about the buttons. The buttons were the wage. But the trade was the women at the long table, and the pearls they were not allowed to keep, and the one woman in 1,000 who built a place where they could keep them. And when a girl loses her people and her home, and every door shuts against her, and she comes back to the only water that ever knew her name with $3 and a button on a cord, the trade does not die with the women who carried it. The trade waits under the false floor of a sorting bin on a quiet bend of the river, and in the failing memory of a woman in a county home who has one clear afternoon left in her and has been saving it all this time for somebody to come and ask. Goldie Alquist was 23 years old, and she had slept 11 nights in a closed bait shop, and she had $3 to her name, and she spent it on a forgotten pearl button works on the riverbank at Pearl Landing, Iowa. It was the best $3 she ever spent. If this story moved you tonight, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell us in the comments who is the one person you would go and sit with while there is still a clear afternoon left to sit. Thank you for being one of the people who truly listen. See you in the last warm light of the day.